Okay, so training our students to write well in 2023. Um, I think getting students to write with that fluency and intellectual conviction, the thing that powers them to success in the written exam, is a bit of a holy grail for us as teachers. So I thought I'd do a short presentation covering a few ideas that I've tried out over the last few years. Okay, first thing we want to is to remind ourselves exactly what it often invariably feels like when we're marking essays. And I'm sure we've all been there before. That slight sense of dread, when we open our school bags, and then that's followed by that despair, that moment when a student hasn't even written down the correct title. That absolutely drives me mad. And then the grumpiness sets in, doesn't it? When you feel kind of really sort of out there on your own, you feel that student responses are so far removed from what you imagined you'd actually taught them in the class. Okay, so if you felt that way, you're definitely not alone. I think we're probably all of a great worldwide community of teachers who've just torn our hair out over the years. Last year at our annual subject meeting, we had a talk from a lady called Helen Hanford, who I've done a lot of work with, and I know she's done a lot of research into student literacy and has some really valuable ideas. And I show my students this quote about decision making in writing to emphasise that the most important thing is that they see writing as a process. It's not just one of those chores. It's a genuine intellectual process, and that they are in charge of the decision making, in every single word they choose, and that they've got to develop the skills to really take control. Now, reality is a bit different. Reality is a lot of time they just don't take control. These aren't my phrases, but these are phrases or comments that Helen Hanford has gathered when she's talked to teachers or asked them to sort of like give her a sort of rundown of the most frequently used comments they write on student essays. And I think it's likely you'll probably find something rather similar to your own ideas on this sheet. Okay, so this is the kind of like the aim of this little presentation. It's a talk, I don't know, I think it's about 6 or 7 really simple but effective ideas that help me to get my point about essay writing across to my students. I don't think there's a magic wand to this at all, and I know that every single year, you start again and it's a fresh challenge. But here are a few of the tools that I've tried out over the years. So the first one, it's just about the general feedback that you might give to your whole class about an essay. At the start of the lesson, when you're about to give them all their individual essays back, but you've seen there's a bit of a pattern that has emerged through your marking. Now, I think it's a really good idea to make this visual. If you make it visual, you make it really memorable and powerful. And Helen Hanford, for example, she uses a waterfall to encapsulate the idea that an essay must have a sense of intellectual flow from start to finish, otherwise it doesn't work. Now here's one that I use with my class. I've used that water, but I tend to sort of fall back on bullfighting to get my ideas across. So I show them 2 clips. I tell the class, look, when I this is what I learned from marking your essays. There are only 2 types of essay writer, and then I show them a couple of clips that sort of illustrate that idea. So one's a clip from the crowds in Pamplona, at 8 o'clock in the morning in the San Fermin fiesta, when the bulls are released from one side of the town, hurtle through the streets to the bull ring, and lots of mad people. I did this once years and years and years ago. Gather in the streets, and the bulls chase after you, and you run like mad so that you don't get gored by the bull. So there you go. That's the sort of one of the sort of the first things I show them, and then I contrast it with a clip about the sort of the measure and the control of a bullfighter in the ring. And I always choose a clip of a chap called Antonio Ordonez for this. It makes me sound like a massive aficionado of bullfighting. I'm not advocating bullfighting, but I'm using it in my essay. And Antonio Ordonez is the one I use, and he was a great friend of Ernest Hemingway, and he used to talk of bullfighting as his writing. You know, he saw that in his bullfighting there had to be a sort of narrative and control of the narrative, and that he was in control. And if he lost control, then the consequences were pretty bad. Okay, so anyway, there you go. That's the point I'm trying to make. So moving on. The point I was trying to make is this: you know, the bull is your essay title, and either you run from it, hoping its horns don't gore you, or you do everything in your skill to control it. And I think it's that issue of intellectual control that I want to really front load with my students. I want the idea of intellectual control at the forefront of my students' minds when they plan and write. So there you go, bullfighting for me, and it's a waterfall for Helen Hanford, but they're both powerful and kind of interesting ways of getting a point across. Okay, here's another slide, nothing to do with bullfighting, but it's quite a good one for more general feedback. Okay, with a clear visual element. Now, I think if there's one thing, well, there's loads of things, isn't there? But if there's one thing that really drives us mad as history geography teachers, more than anything else, I think it's when students do not put precise, detailed examples into their essays to illustrate their argument. And surprise, surprise, if you don't put precise examples in, you can't really explain the significance of the point you're making with any great conviction. And so your argument begins to collapse bit by bit, and you probably feel less and less like a matador with every sentence, and more like somebody who's running like mad to avoid being gored by a bull. So, you know, rather than writing endlessly, add more detail, put detail in here, where is the detail, another million times in the margin, I decided to call upon the metaphor, if you like, of the weatherman, and ask a class which weather report they would find most useful. You know, is it the one that says in the next week it will be a bit foggy in some parts of Britain and very sunny in some parts too, and there could be some rain in a bit of England? Or is it the one that says the northwest of England will experience thick fog between 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. tomorrow, temperature range of 6 to 9 degrees. Once this is cleared, there will be sun for much of the day until 7 p.m. when heavy rain is forecast for the rest of the evening. You know, it's a kind of like simple and fun way of putting them in the position of the reader. You know, and as the reader, they are seeing that they are the recipient of someone else's analysis, and they make a very clear judgment about the analysis. And clearly, as a class, they don't think much of the wishy-washy, rubbish, sort of vague weather report on the left, and they rather like the manner in which the one on the right was done. So there you go. That gets a point across pretty clearly, I think. Okay, next one. Obviously given a few ideas on sort of visually giving general feedback. Now I want to move on to perhaps embedding some of the essential writing techniques which will turn our students into matadors. So first one, I think, is dead simple but really important. It's to provide our students every single time, you know, every time they are about to write, provide them with an essay planning sheet and insist that they hand this essay planning sheet in with the essay. You know, if you've got time, get them to do the planning in class so that you are hovering over them and you can see exactly where they're going wrong, you know, if they're not putting any detail in, etc. Now, with the essay planning sheet I use, I try to take them through the whole process. So step one, obviously, you've got the essay title at the top of the sheet. I haven't put it in here, but you get them to read the question, underline the command words, and anything other that is significant in that title. And then the step two is to get them to spidergram, you know, mind map everything they know about that question. And then from that, they can decide what is their position, you know, what is the key argument they're making, what's their position in relation to the question. And then they can start prioritizing. They've decided what their position is. So now they can think about what are, prioritizing what are the 3 big arguments I wish to make in my essay. Once you've done that, the next stage of your writing should emerge. You've clarified what your position is. That's the direction of the essay. You've clarified what the 3 key arguments you wish to make are. So what ought to be coming clear to you now as a student, the writer, is the shape your introduction is going to take. So that's the moment when you get them to carefully plan and write their introduction. You'll find most students will just sort of look at the essay title and immediately want to hurtle into the introduction, in a blaze of inspiration. But if they do that, they are going to run out of steam very, very quickly. They have to go through this process first. As I say, it's well worth doing all of this in class if you have time. Once they've written the introduction, there's a really good question by Helen Hanford that I use with my classes, which says, if you covered up the title, would your reader know what the essay question was by reading your introduction? And if the answer to that is no, not really, then you put a line through that introduction and you write it again, because you have not provided clarity. You're not giving your reader that compass by which they can navigate their way through your essay. Okay, so we've talked about control being an essential ingredient in an essay, and this is something I do to really put students in control. I always, every time, and it's the same list, but every time they are writing an essay, I will put this in their essay planning sheet. I give them a bank of academic English phrases, that they can steal from, that they can use in their writing. And for me, these sorts of phrases are the building blocks of an essay. They are what gives an essay its structure, what helps a student to sustain their analysis and develop their argument from start to finish. So if you give those students the tools, you might well find that they are able to transform their writing, because they've always got these really nicely phrased sentences to choose from. Okay, my next idea is this. This is something I was introduced to last year by my colleague Keith Sykes, and I think it's a brilliant and dead simple idea. So it's this: before you set an essay, create your own mark scheme, okay, and give it a code. In this case, it's a code from A to N. And explain to your class, show them this mark scheme and explain to your class, you're not going to write anything in the margin when you're marking. You're simply going to be using those letters. So as you can see, if it's A to F, these are the really good features that you will have identified in each of their paragraphs. And you'll have written those down every time you come across it. So every time you come across precise use of historical evidence, statistics, factual evidence, quotes, you put a C. Every time there's a developed explanation, you put a D. Every time you see really good use of academic English, those sort of phrases we looked at, you put an E, etc., etc. Really quick and effective code, so it's going to speed up your marking no end. And the other side, obviously, is the letters G to N. Those are the letters that's the code that refers to features of the essay that have not gone very well. So what it does here, I think, is it enables students to see patterns in their work. They can start to identify the moment when a paragraph went wrong. And that's, once they start identifying that point, it might be because they use rather sort of floppy and ineffective topic sentences, or it might be because the evidence is not vague. But they'll be able to see that moment and think, yes, that's the thing I've got to work on. And you can use these, when you give an essay back, you can tell students, if you've got anything from G to M, you need to go back to this code and you need to write down what G or H or I or J or K or L or M actually mean, because they are going to be your targets for the next piece of work. Okay, this is how else I've used this. I've used this to provide a model for students as well, so using this marking code. So this is an example of a paragraph from a premiere student, first piece of writing she did for me, and it's a paragraph, it's an essay that went really, really well. So I used it as a model for the class, to again to sort of emphasize that idea of an intellectual rhythm that exists in successful writing. So I'll just put my letters down here. It's a shame I put the yellow thing on there, but you can see, you know, from my code, I've put a, you know, really strong topic sentence, followed up by precise use of evidence, and then there's an explanation of the evidence, and then there's more evidence, and then there's an explanation of the evidence, and then there's another rich body of evidence, a CC, and an explanation, and then she ends off that paragraph with a really clear conclusion. And students are beginning to see that sense of rhythm, particularly the combination of features, you know, a powerful leading sentence, a topic sentence to lead the argument, followed by precise evidence, and then inevitably, once you've given evidence, you'll want to explain why it works. It's a good way, I think, of getting students visually to see there is a pattern, and if they can start thinking about that pattern, they're going to improve no end as writers. Okay, I also inevitably I give these model essays back, and I tell the students, well, you tell me what you think. You find some good features of writing in this, you know, ideas that you can steal. And this is what one student said to me last week with this paragraph. And she was amazed, I think, by the number of connective phrases that the writer had employed. And I think she was definitely keen to make sure she did that in her next piece of work. Because like the phrases I've given, you know, they're the building blocks. They're the things that really give an argument its clarity and its structure. Okay, getting towards the end now. Here's the next one. It's all about feedback to students, you know, not general feedback, but individual feedback. And one of the things, you know, we'll all feel as teachers is that, you know, we are imparting incredibly important news to our students. You know, it could be very grave news about a disastrous essay, or really positive news about how well they've done and why. But, you know, the manner in which we give that feedback is often really self-defeating. And I'm referring here to the sort of you know, the American paperboy image on the right. Because inevitably we're in a bit of a hurry, aren't we, at the start of a class, and we go around the class and we just quickly give them their essays back, just as they're getting all of their books out and they're chatting to their mates, and they might have a quick glance at it and think, oh God, it's another disastrous essay, and hurriedly shove it into their bags. And we've no idea really of whether they've actually read it or really understood our feedback or really taken it in. So I think the manner in which we give it is dead important. This is what I do, and it takes bloody ages, but it is worth doing. I make sure that feedback for essays is individual. So I get students to come to the desk, you know, and it might take 2 or 3 minutes to take the students through, you know, each student through their essay. So you're going to have to set some sort of research or reading task for the rest of the class as you call them all out. But it's that moment when you're talking to them, you know, quietly on an individual level, and you're making sure they understand exactly what they have to do, and you're making they understand that you really respect and value them as well. I also make sure I don't give them a mark. You know, I might have put a mark down in my mark book, which generates, you know, the notes for the bulletin. But right now, all I want them to have is my feedback, because the mark itself does not provide them with a guide on how to write a good topic sentence, or how to provide precise evidence, or how to develop an explanation. It's my feedback that is going to do that. And that it's the feedback ultimately that helps them to acquire the skill to get good marks in the end. So I would start making it your practice to get rid of marks from your classroom, just give feedback. Then make sure they're not overwhelmed by the enormity of the whole thing. You know, just give them 1 or 2 manageable targets for their next piece of work. something they really feel that they can do, that they can achieve. And then from then on, make sure that they write those targets, at the top of their essay planning sheet the next time you do it. So that when you've done their, mark their next essay, you can refer to their targets and you can tell them whether you thought they really met those targets or not. There's another piece of advice here. This is a picture of a very famous British or English football manager called Brian Clough, who was manager of Nottingham Forest, who did really well under his time as manager. And there's a famous story of Clough who had a player on the pitch, or a player who'd been involved in a head collision, and he'd been knocked out, and he's flat on the ground, and Clough is screaming at the trainer to say, "Get him up, get him back on the pitch." And the trainer's saying, "Brian, I can't. He's out cold. He doesn't even know what his name is." Clough's response to that was, "Tell him he's Pele." Obviously, I've missed out the essential Brian Clough expletive in the middle there. And old Brian is being pretty facetious, but as a teacher, I've kind of taken that on board. And I think, something, there's one thing you can teach your students about structure and phraseology and tell them it's so important to put detail in, etc., etc. But the one thing you've got to give them is a sense of confidence. If they're going to write well, they will write with conviction. And it is your job to give them a sense of conviction, a sense of confidence about themselves. So whenever you're giving feedback, just make sure, you are finding something that enables you to say, "I think you've got so much potential. I think you're going to be a seriously good writer. You just need to work on that." That might be the sort of the magic glue that binds the whole thing together. Okay. Here's a couple of things that can quickly, help your students gain their confidence. Good writers hear their voice, their intellectual voice as they write, because they respect their ideas and they respect the manner in which they phrase their ideas. So the more we get our students to hear their voice in class and to respect their voice, the better. I use lollipop sticks in my class, the sort of bâton sucette. And rather than getting students to put their hands up, I write their names down on those lolly sticks so that I get to choose who answers questions. That way, everybody in a lesson always gets to speak. And it means everybody's got to listen as well. And everybody knows when they speak, they've got to really, develop their ideas. So that's a really, really important, very inclusive techniques. Have lots of oral debates. When you're having any form of oral debates, you are practicing thinking. And if you're practicing thinking, you're practicing writing at the same time. I know that Siobhan last year gave a really, really good idea. She's done it before. About how she sets up oral debates in her class to get students to practice the structuring of an essay. I get my students to do lots of oral recordings as well, which again, I think in the privacy of their own home, allows them to hear their voice and allows them to hear the rhythm of their argument. And that way they are teaching themselves as they go along. Okay, final thoughts. I don't think any of this is easy. I think it's always worth sharing with your class the struggles you would have had as a student and making the point that you think, yeah, it is hard. It's a challenge. But we're all in this together, and it's a challenge that you can deconstruct into 5 or 6 different things that they have to work on in order to get there. I understand that essay feedback, the sort of thing I've talked about, can take an awful lot of time out of a lesson. So I think the more of it we do in the lower years, when we do have time, we're not facing the exhausting run from September to June of an exam year, but we can take our time in 6e, 5e, 4e, the college years, and even 3e, 2e and première, we have more time. The more time we take on employing these techniques, the easier our job will become as terminal teachers. So that's the end of my little presentation, and I wish you the best of luck with your teaching this year.